Finally, what about his fifth argument based on the suffering in the world? Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that the pain and suffering in the world is a tremendous emotional obstacle to belief in God. But that doesn't mean that this is a good intellectual argument against belief in God. I'm persuaded after much reflection on this problem that as difficult as pain and suffering might make it emotionally to believe in God, intellectually, the atheist is really shouldering an enormous burden of proof here which he cannot successfully sustain. Dr. Dacey's key claim here is that pointless suffering exists. Now, that claim is extraordinarily difficult to prove. In order to prove this claim, the atheist must prove the further claim that God does not have good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. But how could the atheist possibly know that? When some incident of suffering enters into our lives, how could the atheist possibly know that God does not have a morally adequate reason for permitting it? Well, Dr. Dacey is aware of this problem, and so he gives a further argument to show that God cannot have good reasons for permitting suffering. But the problem is that both of the premises of that argument are pretty clearly false. Take the first premise that he gave. He says, we don't know of any kinds of goods that would morally justify God's permitting suffering. Well, I think that's just obviously false. I can think of all sorts of goods that would justify God's permitting suffering. From a Christian point of view, speaking in the broadest terms, God's purpose for human history is to bring as many people freely to a saving relationship with himself, thereby securing their eternal life and eternal happiness. And I think it's not at all improbable that only in a world pervaded by natural and moral suffering would the maximum number of people freely come to know God and his salvation. So to carry his argument, Dr. Dacey would have to show that there is a possible world that God could create which has less suffering than the actual world, but has an equal amount of the knowledge of God and his salvation. And that's just pure speculation. But that's not all. The second premise, I think, is also wholly implausible. That premise says that if there were goods that justify God's permitting suffering, then we would know what they are. Well, I don't think that's true. The atheist seems to presuppose that if God has good reasons for permitting suffering in our lives, then he's somehow obliged to tell us what they are. But that seems very implausible. It would turn the universe into a haunted house. Every time I stub my toe, a voice would whisper, here's why I'm permitting this. And this would really get to be annoying after a while. Worse, what Dr. Dacey is asking for may well be logically impossible. For in certain cases, if God were to say, here's why I'm allowing this, then we might act in such ways as to prevent the justifying good from coming about, so that the suffering in that case would take place if and only if the suffering did not take place, which is logically impossible. So in that case, Dr. Dacey's premise is necessarily false. So I don't think his argument that God cannot have good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world is very good.